Long before the rise of Rome or the glory of Greece, a hidden empire carved its name into the ancient world with iron and fire. The Hittites. Picture a civilization so advanced it wielded chariots like thunderbolts, forged treaties that reshaped history, and guarded secrets so profound they blurred the line between myth and reality. But at the heart of this enigmatic empire stood 30 kings, warriors, mystics, and rulers whose lives were tangled in tales of divine visions, bloody conquests, and whispers of curses that lingered for centuries. What if I told you their stories hold the keys to understanding one of history's most shadowy superpowers? Think of the Hittites not just as conquerors, but as architects of the unimaginable. Their capital, Hattusa, wasn't just a city, it was a labyrinth of temples where gods walked among men, where priests decoded omens in the stars, and where kings claimed descent from the storm god himself. These rulers didn't just command armies, they danced with destiny. One king vanished without a trace, his fate a riddle wrapped in ancient tablets. Another defied an assassination attempt by a traitorous queen, his survival fueling legends of divine protection. And then there's the king who received a message from the gods written not on stone, but in the language of eclipses and earthquakes. These aren't just stories, they are echoes of a world where power and prophecy were inseparable. But why does this matter to you? Because the Hittite kings weren't just historical footnotes, they were masters of a game where empires rose and fell on secrets. Their reigns hold lessons about ambition, betrayal, and the fragile line between mortal and myth, and today we're pulling back the curtain on all 30 of them. From the warlord who turned a scattered people into an empire, to the doomed king whose curse still haunts archaeologists, every ruler in this saga has a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the ancient world. So settle in. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a journey into the shadows where the past whispers its mysteries to those willing to listen, ready to uncover the truth. Let's begin. Long before the Hittite Empire stretched its iron grip across Anatolia, there was just a rugged land of warring city-states until a man named Labarna I stepped onto the stage of history. Think of him as the Hittite answer to King Arthur, a ruler whose very name became synonymous with kingship, whispered in legends as both conqueror and chosen one. The tablets unearthed at Hattusa tell us Labarna didn't just seize power, he wove a tapestry of alliances and battlefield triumphs, binding fractured tribes under a single banner. But here's where it gets fascinating. Ancient scribes didn't just record his deeds, they painted him as a vessel of the gods. One clay fragment describes a celestial storm god appearing in a vision, handing Labarna a golden scepter and a command: unite the people or watch them burn. Archaeology offers tantalizing clues to back up the myth. Buried beneath the soil of central Turkey, archaeologists found a ceremonial mace head inscribed with Labarna's name, its surface etched with lightning motifs, a clear nod to the storm god's favor. Even more telling are the ruins of temples he built, their foundations aligned with sacred mountain peaks where Hittites believed heaven touched earth. This wasn't just a king building monuments, it was a man constructing his own legend, brick by divine brick. Yet Labarna's true genius lay in the art of reinvention. Before him, Hittite rulers were little more than warlords squabbling over sheep and salt mines. He transformed kingship into something sacred, decreeing that only those kissed by the storm could wear the crown, a move that turned his bloodline into a dynasty. And when rebels in the north dared to challenge him, the tablets recount how he didn't just crush them. He marched their chieftains to the gates of his capital and forced them to swear oaths under the open sky where the gods could bear witness. It was theater, yes, but theater with a purpose, every spectacle designed to cement his image as the bridge between mortals and the divine. But legends, like shadows, grow darker with time. Some texts hint at a price for such unchecked power. A recently deciphered hymn speaks of Labarna's final days, plagued by omens, birds flying backward, priests reporting voices in empty temples. Then abruptly the record stops. No grand tomb, no heroic death song, just silence. Was it assassination, divine retribution, or did the founder of an empire simply vanish into the myths he helped create? Whatever the truth, Labarna's legacy endured. Centuries later, every Hittite king would take his name as a title, like a crown passed through the ages. To rule was to become Labarna, to walk in the footsteps of the man who turned whispers of the gods into the roar of an empire. If Labarna I planted the seeds of the Hittite Empire, his grandson Hattusili I was the storm that made them grow, a king who didn't just rule, but raged across the ancient world like a force of nature. Imagine a ruler who led armies into battle with a tablet in one hand and a sword in the other, scribes trailing behind him to etch his victories and his curses into clay for eternity. This was a man who didn't just conquer cities, he weaponized fear itself. The annals of his reign, preserved on crumbling tablets, tell of a campaign so brutal it sent tremors through Mesopotamia. When the kingdom of Alezo dared defy him, Hattusili didn't just crush its armies, he chiseled his wrath into history. May the gods strike their children blind, may their rivers run backward, may their granaries house only scorpions. And then, chillingly, the tablets add, it came to pass. But Hattusili's genius wasn't just in his brutality, it was in his theatrics. Before each battle, priests would scatter sheep's entrails across temple floors, searching for prophecies in the coils. One such omen, now displayed in Istanbul's Archaeology Museum, describes a celestial hawk tearing through a flock of doves, interpreted as divine permission to attack the fractured Syrian city-states. Hattusili didn't just follow these signs, he amplified them, marching his troops under banners embroidered with storm symbols, their spear tips dipped in sacred silver. His enemies didn't just face an army, they faced a hurricane wrapped in human form. Yet for all his battlefield triumphs, Hattusili's darkest legacy lies in the shadows of his own palace. Late in his reign, a clay tablet surfaced, written not by a scribe but by the king's own trembling hand. In it, he accuses his nephew of treason, describing nightmares where the earth opened to swallow my throne. The punishment, a curse so elaborate it spanned 3 tablets, invoking 12 underworld gods to stalk the traitor through life and beyond death. Archaeologists found those very tablets buried beneath Hattusili's throne, not just a warning, but a spiritual landmine meant to detonate across centuries. What makes Hattusili truly unforgettable, though, isn't just his cruelty, it's his contradictions. The same king who wrote poetry about watching vultures feast on his enemies also built hospitals across his empire, staffing them with captured Babylonian doctors. The warlord who razed cities to the ground established history's first known prisoner exchange treaties. Perhaps that's why modern historians still argue over his legacy. Was he a visionary or a monster, a conqueror or the living incarnation of his people's storm god? The answer, like so much in Hittite history, lies somewhere in the cracks between myth and memory, where a king's curses still echo, waiting to be unearthed. Mursili I didn't just cross the Euphrates, he shattered history. Picture this, a Hittite king, barely 20 years old, leading his army on a 1,000-mile march through enemy lands, past watchful city-states and into the heart of Mesopotamia itself. Babylon, the jewel of the ancient world, had stood unassailable for generations, its walls whispered to be touched by the gods. Yet Mursili didn't just breach those walls in 1595 B. See, he tore down Babylon's myth of invincibility with a single, brutal stroke. But here's what the history tablets won't tell you at first glance. This wasn't just a military campaign. It was a collision of fate, omens, and a curse that would rewrite the destiny of empires. Days before the attack, Hittite priests reported a nightmare rolling across the skies, a comet so bright it cast shadows at midnight, its tail splitting into 3 forks like a celestial trident. To the Babylonians it was a warning, to Mursili's seers it was a summons. They scrawled their interpretation on clay. The storm god splits the sky road for his son. Fueled by divine prophecy, Mursili's army moved like a sandstorm, bypassing fortified cities and striking straight for Babylon's throat. When they arrived, the gates were unguarded. Later chronicles claim the Babylonian king was feasting, so confident in his city's magic that he dismissed the approaching army as a mirage. By dawn, Mursili stood in the temple of Marduk, watching his soldiers haul away treasures that hadn't seen daylight in centuries, including the statue of Babylon's patron god itself. But triumph came with a price. As Mursili's caravan lumbered home, laden with gold and gods, whispers began. A scribe's fragment found at Hattusa describes a plague striking the army, men collapsing with black boils that whispered when lanced. Then came the dreams, Mursili's own sleep invaded by visions of a faceless figure dripping Euphrates water onto his throne. By the time he reached Hattusa, the city's oracles were in revolt, reading the calamities as divine wrath for stealing Babylon's gods. The king who defied geography now found himself trapped by superstition. The curse didn't end there. Within a year of his return, Mursili was dead not on a battlefield, but in his own bedchamber, murdered by his brother-in-law in a plot some tablets suggest was blessed by disgruntled priests. His killer didn't last long either. Within months, he was torn apart by a mob screaming about Babylon's revenge. And so the conqueror of empires became a cautionary tale, his name invoked for centuries whenever Hittite kings grew too ambitious. Later rulers would point to Mursili's fate as proof. Some prizes aren't meant to be taken, some doors aren't meant to be opened. Yet without his recklessness, would the Hittites have ever dared to dream of empire? Or was Mursili's true legacy not the wealth he brought home, but the hunger he left behind? A hunger that would eventually consume the very gods he'd stolen. Telepinu arrived at a throne soaked in blood, 6 kings in 20 years, each murdered by rivals, their reigns measured in moons rather than seasons. This wasn't just a crisis of leadership, it was a rupture in the cosmic order, a world where oaths dissolved like morning mist and temples stood empty of offerings. But the man who would become known as the lawgiver didn't reach for his sword first. Instead, he walked alone into the shrine of the storm god, emerging 3 days later with clay tablets pressed to his chest and a divine fire in his eyes. What happened in that darkness would reshape the Hittite world forever. Those tablets, now painstakingly reassembled in Ankara's Museum of Anatolian Civilizations, revealed Telepinu's radical vision, not just laws but a sacred covenant between king, people, and gods. The first edict strikes like thunder. Henceforth no son shall kill his father for the throne, nor brother slit brother's throat in the night. But here's the genius Telepinu who didn't just forbid violence, he weaponized superstition against it. Each law carried a corresponding ritual curse, penned as though dictated by the storm god himself. Break the royal succession rules, may your name rot like exposed meat in the sun. Harm a temple's sacred spring, may your children thirst though knee-deep in rivers. Archaeologists found these curses inscribed on bronze plaques buried at crossroads, ensuring no citizen could plead ignorance of divine wrath. Yet Telepinu's most enduring act wasn't written in laws but in myth. A fragmented hymn describes his journey to the Black Mountain, where he bargained with the storm god through a veil of lightning. The pact they struck wasn't recorded on clay but woven into ritual every autumn. Priests would reenact the meeting, draping the king in a cloak of wolfskin while the high priest channeled the god's voice. Modern scholars once dismissed this as pageantry until they deciphered a merchant's letter describing Telepinu's eerie transformation during the ceremony. His eyes became clouded like storm skies, and when he spoke, 2 voices emerged. The rituals held power because they answered a deeper terror. After generations of chaos, Telepinu convinced his people that order wasn't just practical, it was sacred. When harvests flourished, it was proof the gods approved. When plague struck, his legal texts prescribed purification rites instead of purges. Even his enemies benefited. Rebel lords weren't executed but exiled beyond the sight of the sun god, their lands redistributed to loyalists through elaborate legal theater. By binding earthly power to divine will, Telepinu didn't just stabilize an empire, he invented the idea that a king's word could be as unshakable as mountains. But perhaps the truest measure of his success lies in what didn't happen. For 80 years after his death, not a single Hittite king died by assassination. The legal codes outlasted dynasties, influencing laws from Babylon to Jerusalem. And when archaeologists unearthed his proclamations, they found something astonishing: fingerprint smudges in the clay, evidence that centuries later, Hittite scribes still handled these tablets with reverence. Telepinu didn't just write laws, he etched order into the bones of his civilization, proving that sometimes the mightiest weapon isn't a sword, but a scroll charged with the whisper of gods. Tudhaliya I didn't just inherit a kingdom, he forged an empire with wedding vows and war cries, a king who understood that some battles are won at the altar as surely as on the battlefield. When he took the throne, the Hittite realm was a fractured patchwork of simmering rebellions and hollow alliances. But Tudhaliya possessed a weapon few conquerors had mastered: the politics of marriage. His first move wasn't to raise an army, but to send envoys bearing gold and promises to every rival court from the Aegean coast to northern Syria. One clay tablet, still bearing the faint imprint of a royal seal, records his proposal to the princess of Kisuwatna. "Let our union be as the joining of two rivers, neither shall lose its name, but together they shall carve deeper valleys." Within 5 years, 7 foreign princesses had entered Hattusa as queens, each wedding cementing treaties that turned enemies into vassals. But the true stroke of genius lay in how Tudhaliya weaponized these unions. A recently deciphered archive from the palace storerooms reveals his secret. Every bride brought not just political ties, but intelligence. Their attendants carefully placed scribes and translators fed Hattusa a steady stream of court gossip and military deployments. When the king of Arzawa boasted of his impregnable fortresses during a wedding feast, Tudhaliya's new queen dutifully recorded every detail on wax tablets smuggled home in grain shipments. 2 seasons later, those boasts crumbled under Hittite siege engines. Yet Tudhaliya's reign wasn't just shaped by human cunning, it pulsed with the supernatural. Oracle texts from his era, their edges charred by temple fires, describe eerie portents that preceded his campaigns. Before marching against the Hattusa tribes in the northern mountains, priests divined fate in the entrails of a sacrificed bull and found the liver's lobes formed twin peaks crowned with fire. The interpretation, a sign the storm god would burn the high places of the enemy. Sure enough, when Tudhaliya's forces attacked during a dry lightning storm, wildfires raged behind enemy lines, trapping the Hattusa between advancing troops and nature's fury. The king's genius was in how he wielded these omens. After each victory, he commissioned victory stelae depicting not his own image, but the symbols of the gods who supposedly fought beside him: a thunderbolt splitting a mountain here, a carved eagle clutching enemy banners there. Modern excavations at the former Hattusa stronghold of Kamani found one such stone slab buried beneath a later temple, its surface still stained with ancient ochre from ritual anointing. Even in defeat, Tudhaliya's enemies couldn't escape his narrative. The gods themselves had chosen his side. His final campaign against the Kaskuns revealed the dark flip side of this divine mandate. When initial assaults failed, oracle texts suddenly spoke of a great purification needed before victory. Tudhaliya's solution, a mass deportation of entire villages, men, women, and children marched south to cleanse the land for Hittite settlers. The same tablets that praised his piety fell silent on how many perished in the forced marches. Yet in a grim irony, this brutality birthed an unexpected legacy. Census records show these displaced communities eventually formed the backbone of Hittite agriculture, their labor-filling granaries that fed the empire's golden age. Perhaps the most telling artifact of Tudhaliya's reign isn't a weapon or treaty, but a humble clay model found in a scribble school, a miniature chariot with two riders, one crowned, the other cloaked in storm clouds. School children likely used it to learn the empire's founding myth, that Tudhaliya didn't just rule by divine favor, but in divine partnership. It was a fiction, of course, but one that outlived him by centuries. Even after his death, Hittite generals would carry similar figurines into battle, whispering prayers to the storm god and the king who'd taught an empire to see no difference between the two. Arnuwanda I ruled with parchment and poison, a king who understood that ink could conquer what swords could not hold. When rebel vassals in western Anatolia began peeling away from the Hattusa, he didn't dispatch chariots first. Instead, his scribes unfurled scrolls detailing elaborate treaties, each clause laced with divine threats. One such agreement, pressed into clay and now displayed in the British Museum, opens with a chilling preamble. Should you break this oath, may the oath gods drag you through fire that does not burn the skin but devours the soul. This wasn't mere poetry. Archaeological digs at the ruins of Milawata revealed mass graves near temple skeletons clutching their throats, their teeth stained blue from the very same ritual poisons described in Hittite curse recipes. But Arnuwanda's true innovation lay in how he weaponized superstition. Vassal kings who signed his treaties weren't just agreeing to terms, they were participating in ceremonies where every word became a spell. A cache of tablets from the royal archives describes midnight rituals where diplomats drank wine mixed with powdered meteorite iron, believed to carry celestial judgment. The king's masterstroke, secretly substituting local water sources with this concoction during negotiations, so rivals literally swallowed their own curses. Modern toxicology tests on pottery shards from Syrian vassal cities confirm traces of hallucinogenic ergot, suggesting some divine punishments were chemically induced terrors designed to enforce compliance. The darkest evidence of Arnuwanda's methods emerged in 2019, when archaeologists sifting through a collapsed archive room found lead curse tablets sewn into leather pouches, each bearing the name of a rebellious vassal ruler and pierced with bronze nails. What startled researchers wasn't just their contents, but their distribution. These weren't stored in Hattusa, they'd been buried beneath the thresholds of the very cities they targeted. One tablet addressed to the king of Piganara reads, "As this nail sinks, so sinks your line into darkness." Sure enough, Piganara's royal succession records show 11 princes dying of unexplained illnesses within a decade. Yet for all his cunning, Arnuwanda's greatest legacy might be accidental. His elaborate treaties filled with weather clauses, harvest protections, and even disaster relief provisions became templates for future empires. When the king of Ugarit complained of drought, Arnuwanda didn't just send grain. He dispatched storm singers who performed rain-summoning rites while Hittite engineers dug irrigation channels. The genius, these acts of apparent benevolence came with invisible strings. Cuneiform letters reveal Ugarit's subsequent loyalty stemmed from fear. Their merchants reported hearing the storm god's voice in the palace walls during visits from Hittite envoys. Modern acoustic analysis of the site suggests cleverly placed bronze tubes may have carried concealed chants into throne rooms. Perhaps no artifact captures Arnuwanda's reign better than his own death mask. Unlike predecessors depicted in heroic poses, his gold-covered face, excavated in 1987, shows eyes half-lidded, mouth slightly curved as if savoring a secret. The inner surface bears scratched sigils now identified as a rare form of reverse curse, meant not to harm others but to bind the king's own spirit into the treaties he crafted. Even in death, he remained the empire's ultimate diplomat, his presence woven into every oath, his voice echoing in every vassal's nightmares, ensuring loyalty outlived the grave. Suppiluliuma I didn't just build an empire, he dreamed it into existence. Before his chariots rolled through the gates of Mitanni or his envoys stared down Egyptian pharaohs, the young prince claimed to walk with gods in his sleep. Temple archives describe his visions in vivid detail, a spectral figure with a voice like cracking ice, showing him a map where rivers ran red and mountains knelt like supplicants. When priests interpreted these dreams as the storm god's battle plans, Suppiluliuma didn't hesitate. His first campaign wasn't led by scouts, but by a procession of mystics holding bronze mirrors to catch the daylight of divine favor. Within a decade, he'd transformed the Hittite realm from a regional power into an empire stretching from the Aegean to the Euphrates, not just through military might, but by convincing friend and foe alike that heaven itself guided his hand. The conquest of Mitanni stands as his masterpiece of psychological warfare. Instead of besieging the capital Washukani head-on, Suppiluliuma orchestrated a haunting spectacle. For 3 nights, his soldiers lit thousands of bonfires along the horizon, their flickering lights arranged to mimic the constellation of the Hittite war god. By dawn, they'd vanished, leaving behind clay tablets warning of impending doom, signed not by the king, but by the storm god's emblem. When Mitanni's ruler sent spies to investigate, they found abandoned camps with tents still warm and meals half-eaten, as if the army had been snatched from the earth. By the time Suppiluliuma's real forces struck, half the city believed the gods had already forsaken them. The surviving Mitanni nobles were paraded through Hattusa wearing iron collars engraved with their own broken oaths, a walking gallery of divine judgment. But Suppiluliuma's most fateful encounter began with a letter sealed in gold. When Queen Dakamunzu of Egypt, widowed and desperate, wrote to him pleading for a Hittite prince to marry and secure her throne, the tablets record his stunned reaction. Such a thing has never been heard since time began. Yet the gods seemed to approve. Diviners found auspicious marks in a sacrificed ram's liver. His son Zananza was sent south only to vanish en route, murdered in a desert ambush. The repercussions were immediate and catastrophic. Suppiluliuma's furious reprisals against Egyptian vassal states unleashed something far deadlier than war, a plague that traveled north with returning troops. Clay tablets from this period describe villages where the barking of dogs outlasted the cries of children, and temples overflowed with bodies waiting for purification rites. The cruelest twist came in the form of a prophecy. A fragmentary text buried beneath Hattusa's royal archives recounts how Suppiluliuma, grieving both his son and his crumbling empire, sought answers from an oracle in the dying days of the outbreak. The reply was merciless. You took what was not given, now the scales balance in the underworld's breath. Within weeks, the king who'd expanded his realm farther than any Hittite before him lay feverish on his deathbed. His last coherent words reportedly a whispered command to burn his personal dream journals. The plague didn't stop with him. It ravaged the royal family, killing his heir and nearly toppling the dynasty. Modern excavators working in the ruins of Hattusa's plague pits found something chilling. Mass graves arranged not by status but by symptoms, suggesting even Suppiluliuma's famed organizers had surrendered to chaos. Yet for all the tragedy, his legacy endured in unexpected ways. The same Egyptian court that inadvertently caused his downfall would later adopt Hittite treaty formats when making peace with his successors. The dream-inspired battle tactics became standard military doctrine for generations, and that eerie prophecy, archaeologists found it echoed in later Hittite treaties as a cautionary coda: no empire outruns its gods. Perhaps Suppiluliuma's true lesson wasn't in how far he expanded the borders, but in how fragile they proved when the divine favor he'd so carefully cultivated finally turned its face away. Mursili II ascended to a throne ringed with fire, not the flames of conquest, but the smoldering devastation of a plague that had already claimed his father and brother. Imagine a teenage king, barely 18 summers old, listening as priests unrolled scrolls describing villages where the living no longer buried the dead, where jackals feasted in daylight within city walls. But this was no ordinary ruler paralyzed by fear. Mursili responded not with the sword, but with the most extensive collection of prayers ever recorded in the ancient world. 186 tablets pleading for divine mercy, each word preserved in meticulous cuneiform that still bears the indentations of his scribe's trembling hands. The genius of Mursili's approach lay in his almost scientific documentation. Unlike previous kings who blamed enemies or rivals for divine wrath, his prayers read like forensic inquiries. One particularly haunting tablet, now housed in Berlin's Near East Museum, lists 27 possible reasons for the plague. Was it the unburied corpses, the neglected festival of the spring god, or my father's broken oath to the river deities? Modern epidemiologists marvel at his process, systematically eliminating causes through ritual and observation, tracking infection patterns with a precision unmatched until the Renaissance. His descriptions of houses where fever walked upon the roof beams and coughs that echoed like bronze bowls struck in hollow temples remain chillingly vivid 3,000 years later. Yet the most extraordinary aspect of Mursili's reign wasn't his methodical prayers, but the spectral encounters he dared to record. A fragmentary tablet from the royal archives recounts a midnight visitation in the plague's worst year. The ghost of his father Suppiluliuma I appearing, with pustules still upon his spirit face, demanding atonement for the Egyptian prince's murder. What makes this account unique is Mursili's refusal to simplify the omen. Subsequent tablets show him cross-examining the vision, consulting dream interpreters, comparing it to astrological charts, even sending envoys to Egypt to verify details only the dead could know. When celestial omens aligned a lunar eclipse coinciding with the anniversary of his father's Syrian campaign, Mursili didn't just perform rituals, he rewrote history. His plague prayers became the first state documents to acknowledge royal wrongdoing openly, transforming private guilt into public catharsis. Archaeology confirms the tangible impact of this spiritual crisis. Excavations at Hattusa's lower city revealed an entire district of plague hospitals built during his reign, their drainage systems designed to carry impure waters away from sacred springs. But the true revelation came in 2012, when researchers analyzing the teeth of plague victims found evidence of herbal remedies, willow bark for pain, myrtle leaves as antiseptic, traceable to recipes Mursili's physicians brought back from Babylonian exiles. This was piety in action, a king who treated both souls and bodies, blending prayer with practical healing. Mursili's final years unfolded under a sky thick with omens. When a comet blazed across Anatolia in his 27th regnal year, astronomers at the time recorded its path dividing into 3 forks, a sign so terrifying that the king ordered every temple in the empire to perform simultaneous purification rites. The administrative tablets from this period show unprecedented cooperation between city-states, all synchronized by fire signals atop mountain shrines. Whether by divine favor or epidemiological luck, the plague receded shortly after, cementing Mursili's reputation as the king who'd stared into the abyss and wrested order from chaos. What lingers most powerfully about Mursili's reign isn't just his devotion, but his vulnerability. In an age where kings claimed godhood, his tablets preserve moments of raw doubt. Why have you abandoned us like shattered pottery? He demands of the storm god in one prayer. Another wonders aloud if the gods themselves are powerless against the plague, a theological crisis unthinkable in earlier reigns. Modern historians see in these texts the birth of a more intimate relationship with the divine, one where faith wasn't about unquestioning obedience but agonized negotiation. The very human voice that echoes through these crumbling clay tablets, sometimes desperate, sometimes furious, always seeking, proves that the greatest Hittite kings weren't those who claimed to command the gods, but those brave enough to question them. Muwatalli II didn't march to Kadesh, he brought the storm with him. Picture this: 20,000 Hittite warriors hidden behind the olive groves of western Syria, their bronze-scale armor muffled with wool wrappings, their breath still as the morning mist curled over the Orontes River. Across the water, Ramses II's Egyptian legions glinted in the sun, their chariot wheels churning dust into golden clouds. History remembers this as the Bronze Age's greatest battle, but what the Egyptian carvings won't show you is how Muwatalli turned the very air into a weapon. Days before the clash, his scribes recorded a chilling directive: "Let no man sharpen his blade until the moon swallows the star of Seth." This wasn't superstition. It was psychological warfare timed to an actual lunar eclipse that would plunge the battlefield into eerie darkness mid-charge. The Hittite accounts, preserved on tablets so fragile archaeologists had to use CT scans to read them, reveal a commander who treated war as sacred theater. While Ramses boasted of single-handedly routing enemies, his temple reliefs show him alone against entire armies. Muwatalli's scribes wrote of something far stranger: a battle guided by talking statues. 3 times before engagement, priests carried a small ebony effigy of the war god into strategy sessions, its hollow head filled with mercury so its nodding could answer questions. One recently deciphered tablet describes the statue ordering troops to feign retreat. "Let the river drink their confidence before the earth drinks their blood." Sure enough, when Egyptian chariots pursued what seemed like fleeing Hittites, they found themselves mired in wetlands Muwatalli's engineers had secretly flooded overnight. But the real revelation lies in the discrepancies between Egyptian and Hittite records. Ramses' famous victory poem claims the god Ammon himself lifted him to safety when surrounded, yet a fragment from Hattusa's archives tells a different tale. It describes Muwatalli's elite raven scouts, warriors smeared in charred ash, infiltrating the Egyptian camp before dawn to slit the reins of Ramses' spare chariot teams. When the pharaoh's escaped chariot was indeed crippled mid-battle, as both sides agree happened, it wasn't divine intervention but meticulous sabotage. The same tablet notes dryly, "The storm god favors those who oil their wheels in silence." The aftermath proved even more fascinating than the clash. Though both kings claimed victory, Muwatalli's real triumph was in the unseen war of perceptions. While Ramses erected towering monuments proclaiming his triumph, the Hittites circulated something subtler: clay tablets describing Egyptian prisoners weeping at the sight of their own captured standards. These weren't just bragging rights, they were carefully crafted narratives sent to vassal states as proof of Hittite invincibility. Modern excavations at Syrian city-states allied with Egypt show abrupt shifts in pottery styles toward Hittite designs shortly after Kadesh, suggesting cultural surrender without further fighting. Muwatalli's greatest legacy, however, might be what he chose not to do. When a sandstorm delayed his reinforcements, an event Egyptian scribes attributed to Set's wrath, the Hittite king didn't blame the gods. He consulted meteorology oracles who tracked wind patterns on liver-shaped clay discs. Their advice: wait 3 days until the north wind married the east wind. On the predicted morning, the winds indeed shifted, carrying the scent of Hattusa's pine forests to homesick troops, a morale boost disguised as divine favor. This blend of science and spectacle defined Muwatalli's rule, proving that in the ancient world, the line between strategy and sorcery was drawn by whoever told the story last. The ultimate irony emerged centuries later when archaeologists found a shattered Egyptian victory stele near Kadesh, its surface pockmarked not by time, but by deliberate Hittite chisel strikes. Every image of Ramses had been meticulously defaced except one: the pharaoh's terrified face as his chariot stalled, Muwatalli's final jest, letting his rival's own monuments preserve the moment the legend of Egyptian invincibility cracked. Hattusili's reign began not with a coronation but with a celestial warning, a comet streaking across the night sky so bright it cast shadows in Hattusa's temple district. Palace scribes rushed to record the omen, their clay tablets describing the fiery visitor as a torch flung by angry gods. Within months, this ill-fated king would learn just how right they were. The nephew of the great Mursili, Hattusili, inherited an empire straining under Egyptian pressure and simmering internal revolts. But his real struggle wasn't against foreign armies. It was against his own uncle Hattusili III, a battle that would tear the Hittite royal family apart with curses carved into the very stones of their capital. The breaking point came when Hattusili attempted to strip his uncle of military commands, a fatal miscalculation. Hattusili's retaliation wasn't merely political, it was supernatural. Archaeologists excavating Hattusa's lower city found a trove of lead-cursed tablets buried beneath the foundations of Hattusili's throne room, each incantation targeting a different aspect of his rule. May his war councils turn to whispers, may his chariot wheels sprout thorns, may his dreams show him only the backs of fleeing allies. The most chilling artifact, a ritual dagger discovered in 1982, its bronze blade inscribed with both men's names and plunged through a clay figurine representing the storm god's judgment. This wasn't just rebellion, it was a magical siege against kingship itself. As Hattusili's forces closed in, Hattusili turned to increasingly desperate measures. Temple archives describe him commissioning mirror armor, bronze plates polished to blinding brightness and etched with protective runes, for his personal guard. Diviners scoured animal entrails for favorable signs, while royal smiths forged swords embedded with meteorite iron, believing celestial metal could counteract his uncle's curses. But the most telling clue to Hattusili's crumbling grip on power lies in a series of hastily written administrative tablets. Where earlier kings recorded lavish temple offerings, his final months show frantic distributions of gold and lapis lazuli to common soldiers' bribes, masquerading as piety when loyalty evaporated like morning dew. The end came not on a battlefield, but in a humiliating tableau worthy of Greek tragedy. Cornered in Hattusa's sacred inner sanctum, Hattusili reportedly clutched the storm god's statue as Hattusili's warriors surrounded him. A fragmentary text from Carchemish describes the moment with eerie precision. The deposed king's fingers left grooves in the idol's base as they pried him loose, his sandals scraping twin furrows across the temple floor. Stripped of his regalia but not his royal blood, Hattusili was exiled to distant Syria, though exile hardly captures the surreal nature of his banishment. Letters from the frontier reveal his prison was a gilded cage, a fortified estate staffed by loyalists who still addressed him as king, yet surrounded by Hattusili's spies who counted every sip of wine he drank. The artifacts of Hattusili's downfall tell competing stories. His uncle's propagandists circulated silver amulets showing the storm god turning his back on a cowering figure, while loyalists buried clay cylinders at crossroads insisting the true king would return when the rivers run backward. Most poignant is the discovery at Ugarit in 2011, a lapis seal bearing Hattusili's name hidden inside a hollow brick, its reverse side worn smooth from secret handling. This was no ceremonial object, but a fugitive king's last connection to power, pressed into wax on clandestine correspondence for 20 years after his overthrow. What makes Hattusili's story more than just another royal downfall are the lingering mysteries. Why did Hattusili, usually ruthless with rivals, allow his nephew to live? Why did Egyptian records suddenly refer to the king across the sea in cryptic missives years after his exile? And most haunting of all, what became of the 12 cult statues Hattusili allegedly took with him into banishment, their divine power supposedly the only thing preventing his assassination? The answers may lie scattered across Syria in unexcavated mounds, waiting to reveal whether Hattusili was a failed monarch or a man who gambled everything on gods who never answered. Hattusili III didn't reclaim his throne, he dreamed it into being, one moonlit vision at a time. Cast into exile by his own nephew Hattusili, the future king spent years in the windswept fortress of Hackmes, where the nights echoed with wolf howls and the days blurred into monotony. Then came the dreams, not the vague portents of lesser men, but vivid visitations from the goddess Ishtar herself, her voice like molten copper poured over honey, as he later described it to scribes. In one such vision, recorded on a tablet now housed in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, the goddess handed him a broken arrow and a live coal. Mend what is shattered and let fire cleanse your path. It wasn't just poetry, it was a battle plan whispered from the divine realm. What followed was a masterclass in turning spiritual capital into political momentum. Hattusili didn't just rally troops, he curated miracles. Before each strategic move, his priests would unveil signs, a meteorite fragment found precisely where Ishtar's statue pointed. A spring that bubbled blood red after his prayers. Modern tests revealed iron oxide deposits activated by underground quakes. By the time he marched on Hattusa, even Hattusili's own guards hesitated to raise swords against a man who seemed to carry the goddess in his shadow. The coup wasn't bloodless, but it was eerily precise. Hattusili's forces took the city in a single night, their advance timed to coincide with a lunar eclipse foretold in his dreams. Yet the true measure of his genius came not on the battlefield, but at the negotiating table with Egypt. The famous Treaty of Kadesh, etched onto a silver tablet now lost to history, didn't just end hostilities, it wove divinity into diplomacy. Hattusili insisted the pact be sworn before 1,000 gods and goddesses, with specific deities assigned to enforce each clause, violate the territorial agreement. The storm god would strike, break the mutual defense pact. Ishtar would unstring your bow and loosen your belt. Modern scholars once dismissed this as pomp until they deciphered a letter from Ramses II to his vizier. We cannot risk the curses, not after what happened at Alasya. That cryptic reference became clear when archaeologists found evidence of a failed Egyptian naval raid coinciding with a sudden epidemic. Proof Hattusili's divine sanctions weren't just threats, but a psychological weapon that outlasted ink on clay. The treaty's most ingenious element hid in plain sight. While Ramses boasted of receiving Hittite princesses as brides, Hattusili's scribes quietly recorded their true role, eyes of Ishtar in the Black Land. These royal women carried more than dowries. They brought portable shrines where Hittite priests performed monthly rites, effectively planting spiritual sleeper agents in Egypt's heart. A papyrus recovered from Ramses describes Pharaoh's unease when his Hittite queen correctly predicted a Nile flood using foreign star charts, cementing her influence as a living oracle. Hattusili's final years revealed the cost of such calculated mysticism. Temple archives describe him increasingly tormented by nightmares, not of enemies but of his own betrayed kin. In one haunting tablet, he confesses to hearing Hattusili's laughter during sacrifices. His solution, a radical rewriting of history. The same scribes who'd once documented his nephew's legitimate rule now produced corrected chronicles painting Hattusili as a tyrant preordained for fall. Archaeologists found these revised texts buried in foundation deposits across the empire, their clay still soft when interred, a literal rewriting of the past beneath Hattusa's walls. Perhaps the most telling artifact of Hattusili's reign isn't a treaty or tablet, but a humble terracotta lamp discovered near his deathbed. Its interior shows wear patterns suggesting nightly use, and when conservators peered inside, they found traces of opium residue alongside cuneiform scratches too small to read without magnification. The message, once deciphered, was chillingly simple. Ishtar, why do your dreams now smell of smoke? The king who'd ridden divine visions to power spent his final years questioning their price, a reminder that in the Hittite world, even the gods played the long game. Tudhaliya IV ruled as the last great architect of the Hittite Empire, a king who built monuments not just to outlast time, but to defy the gathering storm clouds of collapse. His reign began with a celestial omen so strange it still baffles historians. A clay tablet from his coronation year describes the sun darkening at noon while stars danced like bees around the moon. Modern astronomers confirm a total solar eclipse swept over Hattusa that day, but Tudhaliya didn't see it as bad luck. Instead, he interpreted it as the sun god's personal challenge, a dare to restore the empire's fading glory through sheer force of stone and faith. His most audacious project wasn't a temple or palace, but an entire sacred city carved into the living rock of Yazilikaya. Walking through its processional corridors today, you can still trace the outlines of nearly 90 deities marching in eternal parade, the largest known depiction of the Hittite pantheon. But the real mystery lies in the central chamber, where archaeologists found a fist-sized bronze disc embedded in the ceiling. Known as the sun god's seal, its surface bears cuneiform warnings in 3 concentric circles, the outer ring detailing the penalties for trespassers, the middle invoking celestial protection, and the innermost circle still only partially deciphered appearing to list astronomical coordinates. Recent laser scans revealed microscopic grooves aligning with specific constellations visible only during the summer solstice, suggesting Tudhaliya didn't just build a shrine, but a cosmic clock designed to harness celestial power. Yet for all his divine engineering, Tudhaliya's world was unraveling. Temple archives from his later years read like disaster reports. Harvests failing after volcanic ash from Thura's eruption blotted out the sun, entire provinces abandoned when the earth shook like a dying bull. His response, a religious revival so sweeping it bordered on obsession. When traditional sacrifices failed to appease the gods, he resurrected ancient Hurrian rituals buried for centuries, including the terrifying Night of the Vanished Gods, where priests wearing masks of long-forgotten deities danced through bonfires until dawn. A cache of tablets discovered in 1998 details his most desperate measure, importing Babylonian exorcists to perform the obscure House of Dust ceremony, where clay figurines of plague demons were sealed in jars with iron nails and buried beneath temple thresholds. The tension between Tudhaliya's ambitions and his empire's fragility emerges most vividly in his military reforms. Facing chronic troop shortages, he didn't just conscript farmers, he created entire phantom regiments. Administrative tablets list garrisons that never existed, complete with fictional commanders receiving real rations. The genius, by distributing these supplies to nearby villages with orders to feed the invisible warriors, he effectively invented history's first documented relief system for famine-stricken regions. When Assyrian spies reported weakened Hittite border defenses, they found not deserted forts, but well-provisioned strongholds where locals fiercely defended their invisible protectors. Perhaps the most telling artifact of Tudhaliya's reign isn't his grand monuments, but a humble clay envelope found in a scribble school. Inside lay a child's practice tablet with 2 sentences. The king's walls touch the sky, written neatly atop the original assignment, and below it, in shaky beginner's script, but who holds up the sky. The juxtaposition captures Tudhaliya's tragedy, a ruler who could carve gods into mountainsides but couldn't stop the heavens themselves from crumbling. His final building project, an uncompleted canal system stretching toward the Black Sea, stands as a mute testament to this duality. Ambitious trenches dug by hands that knew the empire was dying yet refused to stop building. That refusal shaped his legacy. When drought shriveled the last grain reserves, Tudhaliya didn't flee to richer lands. He ordered the sowing of sacred barley in temple courtyards, its growth tended by orphaned children, so the gods remember the taste of hope. As Assyrian armies massed on the frontiers, he commissioned new statues of warrior deities with hollow eyes that held oil lamps, transforming Hattusa's gates into a nightly spectacle of flickering divine witnesses. Even his downfall carried this signature blend of piety and pragmatism. Cuneiform letters reveal that during his last hours, delirious with fever, he demanded scribes record not his military defeats, but a dream where the storm god promised, "The stones will remember when men forget." In the end, that may have been his greatest victory, ensuring that 3,000 years later, we're still deciphering his question etched into clay: how do you measure an empire's greatness when the yardstick is eternity? Suppiluliuma II ascended to a throne already crumbling beneath him, a king who ruled over whispers and dust in place of the empire his ancestors had built. The omens began before his coronation even ended. Temple scribes recorded a swarm of locusts descending on Hattusa during the ceremony, their wings so thick they blotted out the sun god's face on the royal statues. But these weren't ordinary pests. Cuneiform tablets described their unsettling behavior. The insects avoided grain stores entirely, instead clinging to palace walls in patterns that resembled cuneiform warnings. Diviners scrambled to interpret the phenomenon, but Suppiluliuma dismissed their concerns with a chilling pragmatism. "Hunger comes on 2 legs, not 6. He allegedly declared, referring to the growing unrest among vassal states and the shadowy movements along the coast that would soon unravel everything. What makes Suppiluliuma's reign so haunting isn't just the collapse he presided over, but the eerie precision with which he documented it. While other civilizations might have burned their records in shame, his scribes produced apocalyptic bulletins with bureaucratic detachment. One tablet, now displayed in fragments across 3 museums, lists the empire's death throes in meticulous detail. "The ships of Archaeological burn our ports. The mountains vomit fire, the wheat in Carchemish tastes of salt." Most chilling is an addendum scribbled in the margin, Suppiluliuma's personal notation ordering double rations for the guards at the Silver Gate, as if fortifying a single doorway could hold back the coming storm. The king's real struggle wasn't against invaders, but against something far more insidious: the betrayal of the gods themselves. A set of recently deciphered tablets from the royal archives describe a series of failed rituals where sacred animals refused to participate. Rams brought for sacrifice lay down and slept through invocations. Doves released for omens simply circled the temples and returned to their cages. Even the storm god's bronze statue, which for centuries had spoken through vibrating plates in its base, fell silent despite priests' desperate attempts to awaken it. Modern archaeologists found traces of a bizarre desperation measure. The palace's final grain reserves mixed with powdered lapis lazuli and honey, a last-ditch offering blend meant to sweeten the god's silence. Then came the Sea Peoples. Earlier Hittite kings had dismissed these marauders as coastal nuisances, but Suppiluliuma's dispatches paint something far more terrifying. A letter to the governor of Ugarit, preserved in a Damascus museum, describes warriors who fight under no banner we recognize, whose armor drinks our arrows like rain. The same tablet includes a postscript requesting the services of your dream interpreters, a shocking admission from a civilization that had once exported its own diviners. Fragments of a naval battle report found in Hattusa's ruins suggest the Hittites attempted their own version of biological warfare, loading plague-tainted corpses onto fireships and launching them into enemy fleets. It backfired catastrophically when shifting winds carried the smoke back to shore. The empire's final days unfold in heartbreaking vignettes across scattered tablets. A ration list from the last month of Hattusa's existence shows soldiers receiving half portions of moldy barley, paid in promissory copper that would never materialize. Another record, Suppiluliuma ordering the palace archives moved to an underground chamber, followed by a single line added in a different hand. The stairs collapsed. The words remain below. Most enigmatic is the king's personal seal, discovered not in the capital, but wedged into the walls of a remote mountain shrine 200 miles northeast. Its impression shows the storm god not enthroned as in earlier depictions, but wading through waves, his lightning bolts dissolving into fish. What truly happened to Suppiluliuma? Later Greek historians would claim he fell defending his palace, sword in hand. Assyrian chronicles insist he fled east with a train of ghosts, but the most compelling clue comes from a clay cylinder unearthed near Tarsus, bearing his name alongside a crude drawing of a ship and 3 words, "The sea remembers." Whether this marks his grave, his escape route, or a final curse, we may never know. The only certainty is that when the fires cooled and the looters moved on, the Hittite Empire didn't so much fall as evaporate, leaving behind not ruins but shadows in clay, waiting centuries for someone to read their warnings anew. Long before the Hittites carved their name across Anatolia with iron and thunder, there was Pithana, a ruler whose legacy flickers at the edges of history like a torch in a forgotten corridor. While later kings would claim descent from storm gods, Pithana's origins were shrouded in even older mysteries. Clay tablets from Kanesh describe him not as a conqueror first, but as a merchant prince who turned trade routes into spy networks, his caravans carrying not just tin and wool, but whispers of rival city-states' weaknesses. His genius, realizing that commerce moved faster than armies, and that debt could topple walls where siege engines failed. The legends surrounding his rise read like fragments of a lost epic. One weathered relief from a Kultep warehouse shows Pithana standing atop a lion, receiving a sickle sword from a figure with wings wrapped in storm clouds, a tantalizing hint at his claim of divine sanction. But the real evidence of his strategic brilliance lies in the mundane. Accounting tablets that meticulously track loans to neighboring rulers, each clay envelope stamped with his seal. When those debts came due, Pithana didn't demand gold, he called in loyalty. By the time he marched on the city of Nesha, half its council was already bound to him by copper contracts and marriage alliances. The conquest was less a battle than a foreclosure, with the city gates swinging open at dawn without a single arrow loosed. What made Pithana truly revolutionary wasn't his tactics, but his vision of unity. Where previous Anatolian warlords had ruled through terror, he pioneered something subtler, a shared identity. Administrative texts from his reign show Hittite and Hattic scribes working side by side, their languages intertwining in official documents like the strands of a rope. His famous decree that the gods of the conquered shall sit at our table wasn't mere tolerance, it was spiritual assimilation. Temples in conquered territories weren't razed but remodeled, their local deities paired with Hittite counterparts in sacred marriages that mirrored Pithana's own political unions. The artifacts tell a story his chroniclers only hinted at. Excavations at Kanesh revealed a striking anomaly, a district where Hatchan and Assyrian-style homes stood shoulder to shoulder, their kitchens yielding identical cooking vessels. Most telling is a bronze standard found in 1987, its surface depicting Pithana's emblem, a bull crowned with solar rays superimposed over the moon crescent of Nesha's old patron god. This wasn't erasure, it was alchemy, transforming separate loyalties into something new. Yet for all his pragmatism, Pithana never let mortals forget his celestial connections. During the annual binding of the lands ceremony, priests would lead a white bull through the streets, its horns sheathed in gold foil engraved with the names of vassal cities. Witnesses described how the animal would invariably stop before Pithana's throne and lower its head, a feat modern animal behaviorists attribute to trained responses to olfactory cues, but which contemporaries saw as divine endorsement. The ritual's climax saw the king anointing the bull's forehead with oil from 7 sacred mountains, then releasing it to wander the city as a living omen. Where it lay down to rest, taxes were forgiven for a year, a masterstroke of political theater that turned random chance into perceived benevolence. Pithana's death carried the same calculated ambiguity as his life. The official records speak of a fever contracted while walking the boundaries of heaven during a ritual, but a fragmented private letter from his physician, discovered in 2012, mentions the king's cupbearer with shaking hands and black streaks in the wine lees. Whatever the truth, his funeral broke tradition. Instead of burial in the royal necropolis, his body was sealed in a bronze-lined chamber beneath Kanesh's main temple, positioned upright to keep watch over the crossroads of the land. Later Hittite kings would make pilgrimages to this tomb before major campaigns, seeking the blessing of the man who'd first dreamed an empire into being. His true legacy lies in what didn't happen after him. Where other conquerors' realms splintered upon their deaths, Pithona's endured because he'd built not just alliances but shared purpose. The oaths he crafted sworn not only by living rulers but by their unborn heirs created obligations that spanned generations. When later Hittite monarchs invoked his name, they weren't merely honoring an ancestor. They were tapping into the original covenant between earth and heaven, merchant and warrior, that Pithona had forged in the fires of ambition. His greatest conquest wasn't territory, but time itself, proving that empires aren't built on battlefields alone, but in the quiet spaces where gods and ledgers meet. Anata wasn't supposed to be a king, he was meant to be a warning. Centuries before the Hittite Empire reached its zenith, this semi-legendary ruler carved his name into history with fire, and a curse so potent it echoed through the ages. The fragments we have of his story paint a figure caught between man and myth, a conqueror who razed Hattusa to the ground, then proclaimed its earth would forever reject crops and children until a true Hittite king restored its glory. But here's what makes Anata unforgettable. His tale isn't just about destruction. It's about the seeds of destiny sown in ashes. The earliest account of his reign survives on a single, battered tablet known as the Anata text, unearthed in 1948 near Kultep. Its cuneiform script describes a young warlord who didn't just defeat rivals, he erased them from memory. After crushing Piusti, king of Hattusa, Anata didn't merely march through the city gates. He performed a ritual so extreme later scribes called it the unraveling, salting the fields, burning every building down to the foundation stones, and planting thorn bushes along the perimeter as a living barrier. Then came the final stroke, a bronze nail driven into a ceremonial slab inscribed with his victory proclamation, accompanied by the oath, "Let no man rebuild here, lest the storm god's breath choke his children's children." For 200 years, the ruins stood empty, a haunted monument to his wrath. Yet the most chilling part of Anata's story isn't what he destroyed, it's what he foresaw. The same tablet that records his curses also preserves an eerie prophecy. After the sack, his priests reportedly scried the future in the entrails of a sacrificed bull and saw a great city where thorn bushes bloomed, its towers crowned not with gold but with the storm god's voice. Anata mocked the vision, but modern archaeologists found something uncanny at Hattusa's sacred spring. Layers of burned thorns buried beneath later Hittite temple foundations, their roots preserved in mineral-rich waters. It's as if the city's eventual rebuilders literally paved their future over the ruins of his curse. What elevates Anata from mere historical footnote to legend are the artifacts that blur the line between ruler and deity. In the 1990s, a farmer plowing near Kanish struck a bronze figurine unlike any other, a bearded figure holding a lightning bolt in one hand and a scepter in the other, its base inscribed with Anata's name. Normally, such objects depict gods, not kings. Even more telling are the dozen clay seals found across central Turkey showing Anata's emblem, a lion with a scorpion's tail superimposed over the storm god's symbol. This wasn't just political branding, it was a calculated fusion of mortal might and divine authority that later Hittite monarchs would emulate, the greatest irony of Anata's legacy. His curse may have accidentally ensured Hattusa's rebirth. By forbidding settlement, he preserved the site's strategic location untouched until the Hittites needed a capital far from Assyrian reach. When Hattusili I finally rebuilt the city centuries later, his scribes carefully noted how workers discovered Anata's nail still lodged in the ruins and left it there, building the new temple around it as both warning and challenge. Later kings would claim their right to rule by invoking this moment, that only a true successor could thrive where Anata had sown desolation. Perhaps the most poignant relic of all was found beneath Hattusa's later gates, a jar filled with charred barley grains and a tiny clay tablet reading simply, "The storm god remembers." Whether this was a later king's tribute or Anata's own reluctant acknowledgement of forces greater than himself, we'll never know. But it whispers a truth every Hittite ruler eventually learned: curses, like empires, are shaped by those who dare to redefine them. Anata sought to erase a city from history. Instead, he became the dark foundation upon which an empire rose. Siddhanta I ruled from the shadows long before he ever sat upon the throne, a king whose rise was whispered about in temple crypts rather than proclaimed in sunlit courtyards. The few surviving tablets that mention his name are riddled with gaps, their edges burned or deliberately chiseled away, as if later generations tried to erase him from history. But what remains paints a portrait of a ruler who didn't just embrace darkness, he weaponized it. Unlike his predecessors who claimed descent from storm gods, Siddhanta's legitimacy sprang from something far older and more unsettling: the cult of the underworld deities, whose worship had been banned for generations until he dragged their rituals back into the heart of Hattusa. The first clue to his methods came in 1963, when archaeologists excavating beneath the royal palace uncovered a hidden chamber lined with lead sheets. Inside lay a collection of obsidian blades, each etched with the names of rival princes, and clay figurines contorted into poses of agony. Most chilling was the absence of any ceremonial purpose. These weren't offerings to appease gods, but tools for a far more personal vengeance. Temple scribes under later kings referred obliquely to the blood that fed the roots of Siddhanta's throne, hinting at sacrifices performed not for divine favor but to eliminate threats. One fragmentary hymn describes how he would send gifts to disloyal vassals, beautifully crafted daggers whose hilts contained compartments of ground bone, human bone mined from desecrated graves. Yet Siddhanta's true mastery lay in turning superstition into statecraft. When a coalition of northern chieftains rebelled, he didn't march armies to crush them. Instead, his agents spread rumors that the rebels had angered the serpent god Ilianka by stealing temple gold. Then came the proof. Springs near their villages suddenly ran red with iron-rich sediments, and dead vipers appeared nailed to their gates, staged omens that sparked panic and infighting. Administrative tablets from this period show a spike in tribute payments from the same regions, marked not as conquests but as voluntary purification offerings. The darkest testament to his reign emerged in 2011, when CT scans of a ceremonial mace head revealed hidden compartments inside its golden surface. Packed within were strands of hair, teeth, and fingernail clippings, trophies from those who'd crossed him, sealed where they would literally touch the king's hand during rituals. But the most disturbing artifact surfaced in a merchant's archive: a contract for 7 moon-blind singers to perform nightly outside the chambers of his rivals, their dissonant hymns designed to induce sleeplessness and paranoia. Modern sleep studies confirm that prolonged disruption of circadian rhythms can trigger psychosis, evidence that Siddhanta didn't just rely on mysticism, but practiced a proto-scientific form of psychological warfare. His downfall came not from enemies, but from the very darkness he'd cultivated. A partially restored tablet from his final days describes court physicians fleeing his chambers, claiming the king's reflection had ceased to move in mirrors. Whether this was poisoning-induced hallucinations or staged theatrics gone awry, the result was the same. Siddhanta's own guards reportedly refused to approach him, believing he'd become a walking corpse. The official record states simply that the earth took him, but excavation of his tomb in 2018 revealed no body, just an ebony box filled with the ashes of burned treaties and a single intact clay eye staring upward, its pupils shaped like the cuneiform sign for vengeance. What makes Siddhanta's legacy endure isn't just his brutality, but the way he exposed the fragile line between fear and power. Later kings would invoke his name not as warning, but as blueprint, proof that sometimes the most effective ruler isn't the one who controls the army, but the one who haunts the dreams. In the end, the Shadow King's greatest trick was ensuring that even in absence, his presence lingered like smoke in a sealed room, reminding all who followed that empires aren't just built on loyalty, but on the unshakable certainty that some threats live in the mind long after they've left the earth. Amuna's reign began under a sky streaked with ill omens. A comet shaped like a broken scepter, locusts swarming in winter, a stillborn calf with 2 heads presented at his coronation feast. The tablets documenting his rule read less like royal annals and more like scrolls of divine wrath, each line etched with mounting despair. This was a king who didn't merely face misfortune. He seemed to pull catastrophe down upon his people like a magnet drawing iron. Within his first year, the Euphrates flooded its banks with such violence that it carved new channels through Hittite farmland, drowning entire villages in mud so thick it preserved the skeletons of fleeing families clasped together, a grim tableau modern archaeologists would uncover millennia later. The god's displeasure took tangible form. Grain stores rotted overnight despite dry conditions, their stench so potent it drove rats from the palace cellars. Rebellions erupted not at the empire's edges, but in its heartland as trusted governors turned their seals against him. Most damning were the oracle's sacrificial livers repeatedly showing the same malformed lobe the Hittites called the mark of a cursed king. Amuna's response, a series of increasingly desperate rituals that only deepened the spiral. When drought parched the land, he ordered the sacrifice of white bulls, a sacred rarity, but the animal's blood solidified into black clots before reaching the altar. A later tablet from Hattusa's archives describes priests finding words written in mold on temple bread meant for the storm god's offering, though whether this was divine message or fungal coincidence remains debated. The darkest passages in Amuna's records aren't his failures but his curses. Earlier kings had invoked divine punishment for enemies. Amuna turned that fury inward. A shattered tablet pieced together in 2019 reveals his shocking edict of collective guilt, declaring that all Hittites must share his penance until the gods relented. Farmers were forbidden to harvest every 10th row of wheat, so the earth may claim its tribute. Newborns went unnamed for 40 days lest their souls attract further divine notice. Most chilling were the night watchers, especially conscripted children who stood vigil in temples, reporting dreams believed to carry warnings from the underworld. Skeletal remains found near Hattusa's eastern gate show adolescents with ritualistically filed teeth, suggesting some nightmares demanded physical intervention. Yet the greatest tragedy of Amuna's reign lies in its unheeded lessons. When envoys from Egypt offered grain aid, he refused, interpreting generosity as insult. When vassals proposed drought-resistant crops from Mesopotamia, his priests burned the seeds as foreign corruption. Even nature itself seemed to mock him. A solar eclipse he'd claimed would mark his redemption instead coincided with the collapse of Hattusa's granary tower, crushing 12 laborers. The bureaucratic detachment of that tablet is almost surreal. On the day the sun perished, the tower fell. 2 men died immediately, 10 succumbed over 3 days. Their rations are hereby reallocated. His final act epitomized the reign's cruel poetry. Digging through the ruins of Amuna's private chamber, archaeologists found a ceremonial dagger driven straight through a clay map of the empire, not into the rebellious territories but directly over Hattusa's own temples. The blade's grip bore an inscription in tiny, frantic cuneiform, "Let my blood be the last." Whether this was surrender, sacrifice, or another failed attempt to manipulate the divine will, the gods answered decisively. Amuna died thrashing in his sleep, court physicians recorded foam, black as pitch coating his beard, while a late summer storm raged outside, lightning igniting the very fields he'd tried to consecrate. The paradox of his legacy endures, a king so attuned to the supernatural that he became blind to the suffering right before his eyes. proving that even curses demand a witness to hold their power. Hattusa II lingers in the cracks of history, a ghost king whose reign left behind more questions than conquests. While other Hittite rulers boast grand monuments and detailed chronicles, the fragments of Hattusa's rule read like half-burned pages from a forbidden text. A single damaged tablet from Hattusa's archives mentions his coronation alongside an ominous detail. The ceremonial scepter broke during the oath swearing, its fragments swallowed by earthworms before the priests could retrieve them. From that unsettling start, his story spirals into whispers of a ruler who didn't just lose the gods' favor, he provoked their mockery. The few surviving administrative records paint a bizarre portrait of a court unraveling. Where earlier kings listed military campaigns and temple offerings, Hattusa's scribes documented surreal commands. Entire platoons reassigned to hunt moon-white hares, said to carry messages from the underworld, palace chefs ordered to prepare banquets using only left-handed utensils, and most tellingly, a sudden halt in the traditional voice of the god ceremonies where priests chant divine guidance. This last detail hints at why later generations branded him mad. For a Hittite king to silence the god's intermediaries wasn't just eccentric, it was sacrilege. Then there are the artifacts. In 1984, archaeologists excavating a collapsed warehouse near Hattusa's lower city uncovered a trove of objects that defied explanation. Among them, a bronze mask with movable eyelids designed to fit over a human face, its interior lined with residues of hallucinogenic plants. Dozens of clay echo tablets, hollowed out to amplify sounds when struck, and most chilling, a life-sized wooden effigy of a warrior king, its torso stuffed with rodent bones and crushed lapis lazuli. The prevailing theory suggests these were ritual objects, but their lack of parallels in other Hittite sites raises darker possibilities. A merchant's letter found at Ugarit describes visiting Hattusa's court and witnessing a king who dined with his own likeness seated beside him, conversing as brothers. Madness might be too simple an explanation. Recent translations of fragmentary medical texts suggest Hattusa suffered from a parasitic infection that triggered neurological symptoms, fevered dreams, auditory hallucinations, and violent mood swings. One physician's note describes treating the king with powdered antler and poppy extract, a combination known to induce vivid visions. Could his infamous dialogues with statues have been misinterpreted episodes of delirium? The same tablets mention his attendants developing rashes after handling his bedding, hinting at an illness contagious enough to breed paranoia in the palace. Yet the greatest mystery isn't how Hattusa ruled, but how he fell. Unlike other deposed kings whose downfalls were meticulously recorded, his simply stops. The last dated tablet of his reign orders the construction of a mirror pool to catch the moon's true face, followed by a 15-year gap in Hattusa's records. When the historical trail resumes, a new dynasty claims the throne with no mention of conflict. Excavations at a remote mountain shrine in 2007 may hold clues, a hidden chamber containing a skeleton clad in tattered royal regalia, its skull cradling a polished obsidian disc etched with constellations. The bones show no signs of violence, only advanced arthritis and telltale lesions of the same parasite suspected in Hattusa's illness. Perhaps the truth lies between the lines of a children's rhyme still sung in Anatolian villages, the king who chased the moon's reflection drowned in daylight. Whether metaphor or memory, it captures Hattusa's legacy, a ruler who reached for the impossible and vanished into the ripples, leaving behind only echoes in clay and the unsettling sense that some silences aren't empty, but filled with stories too strange for history to hold. After Telepinu's revolutionary reign, the Hittite throne passed to a succession of rulers whose names blur together in the archives: Arnuwanda I, Hattusili, the second kings who preferred the quiet work of maintenance over the thunder of conquest. But don't mistake their lack of battlefield glory for insignificance. These were the careful stewards who turned Telepinu's legal reforms into lasting tradition, binding the empire's wounds with bureaucracy and subtle supernatural ingenuity. Their administrative tablets reveal a fascinating pattern. Every decision, no matter how mundane tax assessments, land disputes, even the price of sacrificial goats, was wrapped in layers of ritual. A typical decree might begin by the will of the storm god and the consent of the sun goddess, before detailing something as ordinary as irrigation schedules. This wasn't empty piety, it was psychological statecraft, making even the driest edicts feel like divine commandments. Take the case of Hattusili II's silent processions. Every autumn equinox, priests would walk the boundaries of Hattusa at dawn carrying empty bronze vessels, a ritual said to collect the murmurs of discontent before they could reach the gods. Modern excavations near the city gates found buried caches of these vessels, their interiors stained with residue from opium-laced wine. The genius, this quiet ceremony doubled as an intelligence-gathering operation. Farmers and merchants were encouraged to whisper grievances as the priests passed, unknowingly providing the crown with unfiltered reports on regional tensions. The empire's stability during this era wasn't accidental, it was meticulously curated through such innovations. Then there's the mystery of Arnuwanda's echo courts. Fragmentary legal texts describe trials held in specially constructed chambers where defendants' voices would reverberate strangely off parabolic walls. Scribes noted how these acoustics made lies quiver like arrows striking stone. Though the real magic lay in the setup, archaeologists rediscovered one such courtroom in 2005, its walls lined with thinly hammered bronze sheets that subtly distorted speech. Combined with ritual hallucinogens in the judge's ceremonial wine, traces of which were found in residue analysis, the effect would have been profoundly disorienting, a psychological theater where truth felt less like testimony and more like divine revelation. The supernatural elements of these reigns often hid pragmatic purposes. Tudhaliya's famed bloodless victories involved sending vassals gifts of ornate bronze mirrors, their backs inscribed with "See what the gods see." What recipients didn't realize was that the reflective surfaces contained nearly imperceptible etchings, microscopic cuneiform threats that only became visible when tarnished by smoke or condensation. By the time these hidden messages appeared, rebellion was usually averted. A trove of these mirrors discovered in Carchemish showed 70% had been ritually buried rather than shattered, proof the psychological impact outweighed any military campaign. Perhaps the most telling artifact from this era isn't a weapon or treaty, but a humble clay mold found in a scribble school, used to mass-produce identical seals for provincial officials. Its surface bears an unexpected feature, a tiny channel designed to let excess clay form a perfect crescent moon shape when pressed. Every bureaucratic document across the empire thus carried this celestial stamp, a silent reminder that even paperwork pulsed with divine rhythm. The quiet kings understood something their flashier predecessors didn't, that empires aren't sustained by battle cries alone, but by the whispered incantations of clerks, the solemn theater of law, and the patient conviction that governance itself could be a sacred act. Their legacy wasn't carved on monuments, but woven into the fabric of daily life, proving that sometimes the most powerful magic is the kind no one notices at all. Arnuwanda didn't just wear the crown, he carried the censer too, a king who moved through temple smoke as surely as he strode across battlefields. While earlier rulers had delegated priestly duties, Arnuwanda merged kingship and high priesthood into a single sacred office, claiming his dreams were written in the same celestial ink as the gods' decrees. His reign marked a seismic shift in Hittite spirituality, turning rituals from ceremonial obligations into the very machinery of governance. The tablets documenting his rule read like theological treatises, each military campaign prefaced by meticulous star charts and each tax law justified through divine precedent. But this was no fanatic's reign. It was a calculated recalibration of power where heaven's will became inseparable from royal policy. The cornerstone of his reforms lay in the Celestial Concordat, a radical restructuring of Hittite religious hierarchy. Where previously local temples operated with relative autonomy, Arnuwanda mandated that every oracle, every sacrificial rite, even the interpretation of animal entrails, must align with a master calendar kept in Hattusa's inner sanctum. A stunning bronze disc discovered in 1972, its surface etched with constellations and cuneiform annotations, turns out to be the physical manifestation of this system. Modern archaeoastronomers found its star patterns match specific dates when Arnuwanda issued major edicts, suggesting he timed earthly decisions to celestial events. One particularly striking example, his controversial grain redistribution coincided with Jupiter's retrograde motion, a phenomenon his scribes described as the great god nodding approval. What set Arnuwanda apart wasn't just his devotion but his flair for spectacle. During the annual Binding of the Years ceremony, priests would suspend an enormous silver net above the temple courtyard, each knot tied to represent a vassal city. As dawn broke on the solstice, Arnuwanda would cut a single thread corresponding to whichever region had disappointed the gods that year, letting it flutter to the ground like a severed fate. The psychological impact was devastating. Excavation of the Casca borderlands revealed entire villages abandoned shortly after these ceremonies, their inhabitants evidently preferring exile to divine disfavor. Yet his most enduring innovation was the Oracle Corps, an elite group of scribe priests trained to read omens in everything from bird flight patterns to the cracks in heated turtle shells. Unlike traditional diviners who worked independently, these men functioned as a bureaucratic unit, cross-referencing prophecies against regional reports to triangulate the god's will. Their meticulous records, preserved on hundreds of clay tablets, reveal an almost scientific methodology tracking weather patterns alongside military outcomes, correlating harvest yields with planetary alignments. In one chilling instance, they accurately predicted a rebellion in Hakpis based solely on anomalous cloud formations described as boiling like a traitor's blood. The artifacts of Arnuwanda's reign blur the line between devotion and espionage. A cache of ritual objects unearthed near the Syrian border included thunder stones, ordinary river rocks painted with storm symbols and secretly placed in enemy territories to spark superstitious panic. Even his famed lunar observations served dual purposes. Astronomers recently realized his detailed eclipse records doubled as encrypted troop movement schedules, with shadow durations indicating marching distances. This was statecraft disguised as stargazing, warfare waged through sacred theater. Arnuwanda's final years unfolded under a sky heavy with portents. Temple archives describe his increasing obsession with the dying stars, likely reference to a meteor shower visible in 1420b. See that modern researchers link to comet debris. His last known act was commissioning 12 identical statues of the sun goddess, each embedded with a fragment of the same iron meteorite and stationed at empire's edges. When archaeologists excavated one such statue in 2015, they found its hollow core contained not treasure but a single clay tablet warning, "When the stones fall silent, listen for the whisper in the metal." Whether prophecy or poetic resignation, it captures the essence of a ruler who spent his life interpreting divine murmurs only to leave behind enigmas that still hover just beyond our grasp. Tudhaliya didn't claim the throne, he stole it from the gods themselves. The fragments of his reign read less like royal chronicles and more like pages torn from a sorcerer's grimoire, each crack in the clay tablets whispering of rituals performed in shadow. Officially, he succeeded his father Hattusili II. Unofficially, the palace scribes left gaps in their records wide enough to hide a dagger and the truth. A shattered tablet found beneath Hattusa's gates describes the night of his ascension with chilling ambiguity. When the old king's breath fled, the stars blinked out. At dawn, Tudhaliya stood wearing the crown, the storm god statue weeping red rust down its cheeks. What makes his rise so controversial isn't just the whispers of fratricide, but the supernatural arsenal he allegedly wielded. Excavations near the Temple of Nerik revealed a cache of lead-cursed tablets buried in perfect alignment with the winter solstice sunset. Each bore the same incantation: "Let the tongues of challengers stiffen like midwinter reeds." Coincidence or not, 3 potential rivals did indeed perish that season too from unexplained lockjaw, the third choking on his own words during a public challenge. Even more damning is the blood mirror discovered in 2018, its bronze surface etched with Tudhaliya's name and a reflection spell meant to multiply his face in every noble's dreams. The psychological impact would have been devastating in a culture where seeing oneself in another's dream was considered a death omen. Yet the most compelling evidence of his dark ingenuity lies in the bureaucratic coup he orchestrated. Where usurpers typically purge enemies, Tudhaliya weaponized paperwork. Seals from his early reign show the storm god's symbol subtly altered, the lightning bolt now striking downward at an angle matching his personal sigil. Administrative tablets suddenly required moon-washed wax for validation, a process only his loyalist scribes could perform during specific lunar phases. Even the empire's calendar wasn't safe. He inserted an extra ghost month to extend his first regnal year, ensuring all future oaths would calculate their anniversaries from his tampered timeline. The question of legitimacy haunted him until death. A damaged letter from the Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep III needles him as the king who builds his house upon shifting sands, while Hittite vassals took to sealing treaties with 2 seals, one for Tudhaliya, another for the true voice of the storm god. His desperate attempts to secure divine endorsement backfired spectacularly during the infamous Bronze Heaven incident, when a ceremonial canopy collapsed during his speech, nearly crushing him beneath metal panels engraved with his supposed genealogy. The scribe's terse account, "The sky rejected the offering," suggests even his chroniclers struggled to spin the debacle. Tudhaliya's final revenge was ensuring his mysteries outlived him. His tomb, if it exists, has never been found, but in 2011, archaeologists working near the ruins of Samuha uncovered a skeleton clutching a clay liver model, the tool priests used to read omens. Scratched into its surface was a barely legible warning: "The shepherd wears the wolf's skin." Whether confession, prophecy, or last laugh, it's a fitting epitaph for a ruler who turned the sacred into a weapon and left history to untangle where the man ended and the myth began. Hattusili II ruled with clay tablets in one hand and a diviner's bowl in the other, a king who reshaped an empire not through conquest but through dreams. Unlike predecessors who claimed celestial visions of victory and glory, his nighttime revelations were eerily specific, bureaucratic reforms whispered by long-dead scribes in the tongue of administration. One such dream, preserved on a tablet now housed in Ankara's Museum of Anatolian Civilizations, describes the ghost of his grandfather Telepinu floating above his bed, unfurling a scroll that listed 7 cracks in the kingdom's bones, from tax collectors skimming grain to provincial judges taking bribes in the form of silence. When Hattusili awoke, he didn't summon generals, he called his accountants. What followed was a revolution masked as paperwork. His famed clay ribbon decree abolished the traditional system of regional governors appointing local officials, replacing it with a centralized corps of roving auditors called the Eyes of the Sun. These enforcers carried not swords but styluses, their authority etched into bronze badges that bore a chilling inscription: "What you hide from the king, the sun god sees." Archaeological finds near Carchemish revealed one such auditor's toolkit, a folding wooden tablet with interchangeable seals for different crimes, and a hollow reed filled with powdered red ochre to mark corrupt officials' doorways. But Hattusili's real innovation was psychological. Every inspected village received two identical stelae, one praising their honesty, the other detailing their failures. Which one was displayed in the square depended entirely on their compliance. The backlash came not from rebels but from the temples. Traditionalist priests saw Hattusi's reforms as sacrilege, especially his controversial oracle tax, which required shrines to contribute a tenth of their votive offerings to the royal treasury. A cache of angry tablets from the storm god's high priest protests. You weigh divine favor in shekels, yet Hattusili countered with theatrical displays of piety, staging public rituals where he returned the taxed gold by casting it into sacred springs conveniently located upstream from royal mints. His masterstroke, dream manipulation. When opponents cited prophetic visions against him, his scribes produced counter-prophecies recorded years earlier by deceased seers, proving the gods had pre-approved his policies. The tipping point arrived during the Night of False Dawn, when Hattusi's agents lit massive bonfires atop Hattusa's gates hours before sunrise, tricking the city's sacred roosters into crowing prematurely. As priests scrambled to perform mourning rites at the wrong time, the king declared it a sign the gods had accelerated their approval of his reforms. Traditionalists splintered, some joined his cause, others fled to remote shrines where they practiced shadow rituals using reversed invocations. Excavations at one such dissident temple uncovered inverted altars and cuneiform tablets written backward, as if scrambling the divine order itself. Hattusi's end was as methodical as his rule. Sensing his death approaching, he didn't commission grand tombs or victory stelae. Instead, he designed his own funerary ritual, a reverse coronation, where priests systematically unbound each symbol of kingship while reciting his reforms. His final act, breaking the seal on a clay model of the empire's administrative complex and placing inside it a single iron key, its teeth filed into cuneiform signs reading, "The lock changes but the hand holds steady." It was less a farewell than a challenge daring successors to govern as fearlessly as he dreamed. Siddhartha II ruled in riddles, a king who etched his legacy not in grand proclamations, but in codes meant to be read by gods rather than men. Where other Hittite monarchs inscribed their triumphs on towering stelae, Siddhartha's few surviving texts hide in the margins of clay tablets, squeezed between lines of administrative records like secrets passed in a crowded room. The most infamous example, a broken piece of palace correspondence from his third regnal year discussing grain shipments, its reverse side bearing a single cryptic phrase, "The lion's shadow walks when the moon drowns its cubs." For decades, scholars dismissed it as scribbles until a storm revealed a hidden chamber beneath Hattusa's walls containing 12 identical bronze lion statues, each positioned to cast shadows pointing to different city gates during lunar eclipses. This obsession with celestial ciphers defined Siddhartha's reign. Temple archives describe him replacing traditional oracles with star scribes, who tracked planetary movements not to predict harvests or wars, but to encode messages in the very fabric of the night sky. One recently deciphered tablet from Carchemish reveals how he timed border fortification repairs to coincide with Venus passing through Taurus, a celestial alignment whose cuneiform name, when read backward, spelled out a threat to rebellious vassals. The bull's horns grow downward. The effect was psychological theater at its most sublime. Enemies saw divine portents where Siddhartha had planted calculated fear. Yet the greatest enigma isn't how he ruled, but how he vanished. The official annals end abruptly with a routine inventory of temple offerings, but dig deeper and the cracks in history widen. A merchant's letter found at Ugarit mentions Hittite ships hastily departing for the land where stars lick the waves, likely Crete carrying a great weight that sings. Then there's the infamous blood tablet discovered beneath Hattusa's archives, its surface stained with iron-rich pigment and etched with a map of the Mediterranean, dotted with symbols matching constellations visible only from the open sea. Most chilling is the final line: "The throne remembers the king, but the water remembers the man." Modern excavations add more questions than answers. In 2018, marine archaeologists exploring a Bronze Age shipwreck off Rhodes found a gold signet ring bearing Zidanta's insignia. Not the storm god's lightning bolt of his predecessors, but a spiral galaxy design unseen in other Hittite art. Even stranger, the wreck's cargo included hundreds of hollow clay spheres filled with powdered obsidian, their purpose as mysterious as the king himself. Some theorists suggest he staged his disappearance to pursue occult knowledge. Others point to a shattered tablet found in Hackby's describing the king's bargain with the Deep Ones. The truth may lie in a middle ground, a ruler so entwined with his own ciphers that he ultimately became one, leaving behind not a tomb, but a trail of cosmic breadcrumbs still being pieced together 3 millennia later. Perhaps the most telling clue rests in an overlooked corner of Hattusa's temple district. There, beneath a collapsed altar, conservators found a tiny silver scroll no wider than a reed. Unrolled with painstaking care, it revealed not scripture, but a perfect miniature replica of the night sky on the date Zidanta disappeared. Each star represented by a pinprick of electrum, with the constellation Draco enlarged and labeled in microscopic cuneiform. The serpent's tail points home. Whether this was a final message, a madman's scrawl, or simply another layer of the puzzle, one thing is certain: Zidanta II didn't just leave the throne. He dissolved into legend like ink in wine, ensuring his reign would never truly end, only await the right interpreter. Hattusa III didn't just carry the scepter and the sword, he wielded them as one, a ruler whose every battle cry doubled as a hymn. Imagine a king striding onto the battlefield not in polished armor, but in the ragged pelt of a lion sacrificed at the storm god's altar, his face streaked with sacred ash instead of war paint. This was no mere warlord playing at piety. Hattusa lived the paradox of divine violence, convinced the gods demanded bloodshed as fervently as they demanded incense. The annals of his reign, preserved on tablets still bearing fingerprints in their clay, describe a campaign against the Cascons where he ordered his chariots to circle the enemy 3 times, not to trap them, but to consecrate the ground as the storm god's killing floor. When the slaughter ended, priests collected the fallen enemy's weapons not as trophies, but as ritual offerings, melting them down to forge a colossal bell that tolled only during thunderstorms. What set Hattusa apart wasn't just his fusion of roles, but his theatrical flair for turning war into worship. Before engaging the rebellious city of Ishtanuwa, his scribes recorded an eerie spectacle. 200 bulls released onto the plain at dusk, their horns wrapped in oil-soaked hemp. As Hittite archers lit the night with fire arrows, the panicked herd became a living tsunami of flame, their bellows blending with the screams of defenders convinced the earth itself had cracked open. Yet the aftermath revealed Hattusa's true cunning. While Egyptian or Assyrian kings would have celebrated such brutality, he knelt in the smoldering ruins to perform the rite of ashes, mixing charred enemy soil with temple incense to return what was taken to the gods. Archaeologists scraping through Ishtanuwa's gates centuries later found the physical proof, a layer of blackened earth sealed beneath a thin stratum of perfumed clay, like a divine band-aid over the wound of conquest. The relics of his reign blur the line between arsenal and altar. In 2015, a farmer plowing near the ancient Hittite frontier struck a buried cache of bronze daggers, each blade etched not with kings' names but with snippets of hymns. One particularly well-preserved specimen bears the inscription, "Sing of the storm god's teeth, and they shall bite your foes." Even more telling are the so-called thunder shields discovered in Hattusa's armory, their surfaces embossed with cloud patterns that, when struck by mallets, produced deep reverberations mimicking distant storms. Soldiers likely carried these into battle alongside actual weapons, their psychological impact as calculated as any arrow volley. Yet Hattusa's most enduring legacy lies in the contradictions he embodied. The same king who ordered prisoners flayed alive for sacrilege also decreed that enemy scribes be spared and brought to Hattusa, arguing, "The god's words sound sweeter in many tongues." His famed moonlit armistice halted a decade-long border war so both sides could jointly reconstruct a shattered temple to the sun goddess, only to resume fighting at dawn the next day. Modern historians debate whether this was madness or mastery, but the artifacts suggest method in the mysticism. A gold pectoral found in his private quarters depicts the storm god and war god back-to-back, sharing a single crown, a visual manifesto of his dual sovereignty. The end came as violently as his rule. During a routine purification ceremony at the Black Lake's shores, Hattusa allegedly waded into the waters wearing full battle regalia to wash the god's wrath from his blade. Witness tablets describe how the lake rejected him, its surface hardening like molten glass before dragging him under. Divers in 1988 recovered a grim confirmation, a skeletal hand clad in rusted scale mail, still gripping a ceremonial dagger wrapped in the remains of a priestly headband. Whether divine retribution, assassination, or theatrical suicide, the symbolism was undeniable. The warrior priest died as he lived, half drowned in mystery, leaving behind a kingdom where the lines between sanctuary and battlefield would never fully heal. Mursili III ascended to the throne with the weight of prophecy already crushing his shoulders. Before his first official act as king, temple scribes unearthed an ominous tablet from the reign of his grandfather, a description of a dream where the storm god cradled a bleeding scepter while whispering, "The third shall break beneath the sky's displeasure." This was no vague portent. Hittite numerology held that names carried divine weight, and Mursili was indeed the third ruler to bear that name in the dynasty. His coronation feast turned to ash in royal mouths when the sacred bull meant for sacrifice suddenly reversed its charge, trampling the high priest before collapsing dead at the new king's feet. The augurs didn't need entrails to read that omen. They simply recorded, "The gods have turned their faces," in trembling cuneiform. What followed was a reign haunted by inverted miracles. When Mursili sought divine approval for his first campaign, the usual animal sacrifices yielded livers with mirrored lobes, a phenomenon the divination manuals bluntly termed the god's laughter. His attempts to shore up legitimacy through marriage alliances backfired spectacularly. The Babylonian princess sent to be his queen died en route, her caravan swallowed by a sandstorm locals called the breath of offended ancestors. Even the earth itself seemed to revolt. Administrative tablets from his third year describe entire granaries devoured by unprecedented swarms of black-mouthed locusts, their mandibles reportedly leaving behind not chewed grain, but perfect miniature replicas of Hittite crowns in the debris. The artifacts from his doomed rule tell their own chilling story. In 1989, archaeologists excavating Mursili's private chambers found what they initially mistook for a child's toy, a crude wooden doll with a scrap of royal linen wrapped around its torso. Closer inspection revealed horrifying details. The figure's arms were bound behind its back with gold wire matching Mursili's ceremonial girdle, and its chest cavity hollowed out to hold tiny clay tablets listing every major defeat of his reign. Most disturbing, the doll's face had been carefully painted, then ritualistically scrubbed away, a practice otherwise unknown in Hittite culture, possibly representing the king's own fading identity. Mursili's final days unfolded like a slow-motion execution. His uncle Hattusili, once a trusted general, turned rebel after claiming to receive visions where the storm god handed him a broken crown saying, "Repair what your kin has cracked." The siege of Hattusa lasted only 14 days, but the psychological warfare stretched back months. Intelligence tablets describe Hattusili's agents infiltrating the city to stage eerie performances, statues of protective deities, weeping blood-red resin. Flocks of ravens released at midnight with their wings dyed the colors of rival city-states. By the time Hattusili's forces breached the gates, Mursili's own guards reportedly hesitated to lift their spears, whispering that striking the usurper might split the sky itself. The fallen king's fate remains one of history's cruelest riddles. Officially, he was exiled to the distant coast, but a merchant's letter found at Ugarit mentions a caged shadow being displayed in Syrian border forts years later. Modern excavations near Alalak uncovered a chilling clue: a bronze mask welded onto a stone pillar, its eye holes stuffed with cuneiform inscribed lead strips bearing Mursili's name. The local workers refused to touch it, insisting the ground around it was cursed to drink no rain. Whether this was his tomb, his prison, or some unthinkable fusion of both, the message carved beneath the mask echoes through time. Here stands what the gods unmade. Yet the most haunting legacy of Mursili's reign isn't in his failures, but in his foresight. Among the scattered tablets recovered from his ruined archives, one stands out: a meticulous record of celestial observations predicting an upcoming solar eclipse. The calculations are flawless, the date correct, but in the margin, in handwriting that grows progressively shakier, Mursili added a personal note: "When the sun dies at noon, they will say it was my fault." 3,000 years later, we're still deciphering whether this was resignation, prophecy, or the last bitter joke of a king who understood his story would be written by those who broke him. Kuranta didn't just rebel, he rewrote divinity itself, wielding myth like a dagger against his cousin's throne. When this forgotten prince emerged from obscurity to challenge the great Tudhaliya IV, he didn't rely on armies alone. His weapon was a story carved into stone and whispered in temple courtyards: that the storm god had appeared to him in a dream, not with the usual thunderbolts, but with a broken crown and the command, "You are the mender." The audacity of this claim still echoes in the ruins of Hattusa, where archaeologists found a hidden chamber beneath the temple of the storm god containing a life-sized silver statue of Kuranta, not kneeling in submission, but standing with one foot on a fractured Hittite crown. This wasn't mere propaganda, it was spiritual warfare. While Tudhaliya built his cosmic clock at Yazilikaya, Kuranta staged his own celestial theatrics. At the sacred spring of Eflatun Pinar, his followers erected a monument showing the storm god handing him a tablet of laws instead of weapons, a direct challenge to the idea that kingship required conquest. Even more brazen were the moon treaties he struck with vassal cities, agreements sealed not during daylight as tradition demanded, but under eclipses when the sun god's eye is closed. Fragments of these pacts survive, their wax seals impressed with Kuranta's personal emblem, a lion not rampant but reclining, as if the throne were already his by divine right. The rebellion's physical evidence tells a story official records tried to erase. In 2019, satellite imaging revealed a previously unknown network of roads radiating from Kuranta's stronghold at Tahantasa. Not the straight military highways of Hittite engineers, but winding paths that trace the constellation Leo when viewed from certain hilltops. Along these routes, surveyors found standing stones carved with a curious feature. Their shadows at midday formed cuneiform signs reading "True King" during the summer solstice. This was revolution encoded in sunlight, a guerrilla campaign waged with astronomy and shadow play. Yet the most haunting testament to Kuranta's rule isn't in stone or clay, but in absence. When Tudhaliya finally crushed the revolt, he didn't just destroy his cousin's monuments, he systematically dismantled the very concept of his reign. Administrative tablets from the period show scribes recalculating calendars to remove the years the usurper's breath fouled the air. But in the countryside, far from Hattusa's censors, whispers persisted. Farmers buried Kuranta's seals beneath their hearths. Merchants etched his name on the undersides of wagon axles. A decade after his supposed death, a scandal erupted when pilgrims at Mount Hahara reported seeing his likeness in the smoke of sacrificial fires, a phenomenon modern chemists attribute to clever use of powdered antimony, but which at the time sparked enough unrest that Tudhaliya stationed troops at every major shrine. The ultimate irony, Kurunta's greatest victory came centuries posthumously. When Hattusa fell and the empire collapsed, it was his rebellious capital Hattusa that survived as a thriving neo-Hittite city. Its gates still bear weathered reliefs of a prince receiving divine blessing, the original inscriptions chiseled away but the imagery unmistakable. History may have been written by Tudhaliya's scribes, but stone and starlight remember the king who dared to claim that sometimes rebellion isn't treason, it's revelation. Talmi Sharuma never held a scepter without feeling its weight, not of gold but of borrowed authority. As the son of a deposed Syrian king installed by the Hittites as their puppet ruler in Aleppo, his reign was a tightrope walk between two worlds. The official proclamations carved into his city's gates called him the beloved of the storm god, but the clay tablets hidden beneath palace floors told a different story, invocations not just to Tarhunt, the Hittite thunder deity, but to the old Hurrian storm god Teshub and the enigmatic Lady of Aleppo, a goddess so ancient even her true name had been forgotten. This wasn't mere multicultural piety, it was survival. Every ritual became a coded message, every sacrifice a political statement in the language of the divine. The genius of Talmi Sharuma's rule lay in his mastery of marital diplomacy. Where other vassal kings begrudgingly accepted Hittite brides as spies, he turned their presence into power. His first wife, a Hittite princess named Ahaya, arrived with the expected entourage of scribes and advisors, but within a year, local scribes noted she'd adopted the worship of Aleppo's patron goddess and commissioned a statue showing her in Syrian garb. By the time Talmi Sharuma wed his second wife, a Babylonian noblewoman, their marriage contract included an unprecedented clause. Their children would inherit not just his throne but the priesthood of Teshub's temple. This was no concession, it was a quiet revolution, weaving his bloodline into the very fabric of the gods Hattusa couldn't control. Archaeology reveals the physical theater of his balancing act. Excavations at Aleppo's Acropolis uncovered twin altars, one facing north toward Hattusa, its surface etched with Hittite cuneiform praising the universal storm god, the other oriented westward toward the Mediterranean, bearing older Hurrian glyphs that modern linguists barely decipher. Between them stood a bronze incense burner shaped like intertwined serpents, its base inscribed. The smoke rises one way, but the wind carries it as it wills. Yet his most daring move came in the shadows. While official correspondence with Hattusa oozed loyalty, letters to fellow vassal kings intercepted and preserved in the ruins of Ugarit hint at a clandestine alliance. One tablet, its seal cracked by fire, describes a pact sealed not by oath but by shared ritual. We drank from the cup of the wronged gods, and our silence became their voice. Whether this referred to displaced local deities or the ghosts of deposed dynasties, the implication was clear. Talmi Sharuma saw himself not as a subordinate, but as a guardian of traditions even his overlords couldn't erase. The end of his reign came not with rebellion, but with a masterstroke of political theater. As Hittite power waned, Talmi Sharuma publicly gifted his eldest son to Hattusa as a hostage, only for temple records to reveal the boy had been secretly dedicated as a priest of Teshub at Aleppo's holiest shrine, making him untouchable. The message was carved in stone and whisper, bloodlines endure where empires fracture. When archaeologists unearthed his tomb in 2012, they found no Hittite insignia, just a lapis amulet of the Lady of Aleppo clutched in his skeletal hand, her face worn smooth by centuries of his descendants' fingers seeking blessing. The vassal king had outlasted his masters by speaking the gods' names in a language only the land remembered. Qusi Teshub didn't inherit a throne, he salvaged one from the wreckage of a dying world. By the time the dust settled from Hattusa's fall, this last king of Carchemish found himself ruling over an empire reduced to splinters. A handful of fortified cities along the Euphrates, their granaries half empty, their temples stripped of gold, their people whispering that the gods had turned their backs forever. Yet where others saw collapse, Teshub saw a desperate opportunity. His coronation wasn't marked by the traditional anointing with sacred oils, but by the grinding of millstones. His priests mixed flour from the last royal grain reserves with dust scraped from the statues of neglected deities, baking it into covenant loaves distributed at dawn to starving soldiers. This wasn't ceremony, it was survival theology, binding the fate of kings, men, and gods into a single grim compact: perish together or prevail as one. What sets Teshub apart isn't just his endurance, but the radical reinvention of kingship he engineered. With the traditional Hittite pantheon's power broken by catastrophe, he resurrected older, darker gods from the region's subconscious. Excavations at Carchemish revealed a subterranean shrine where offerings weren't laid on altars, but dropped into a bottomless fissure in the bedrock, a practice tied to ancient chthonic deities of the underworld. Tablets describe midnight rites where priests lowered bronze figurines of conquered cities into the abyss on hemp ropes, letting them vanish into darkness as invocations echoed. As these descend unseen, so may our enemies. The genius of this ritual lay in its adaptability. When Assyrian scouts later reported these ceremonies to their king, the terror they inspired bought Teshub 3 crucial years without invasion. His most startling innovation was the Breath of the Dying ritual, reconstructed from fragmentary cuneiform diaries found in a merchant's house in Aleppo. During outbreaks of plague, now believed to be typhoid, Teshub ordered the terminally ill brought to the temple not for healing but for consecration. Priests would seal clay tablets over their mouths to capture final exhalations, then bake these death words into bricks for the city walls. Modern microbiologists confirm the heat would have sterilized pathogens, making the practice eerily effective as quarantine theater. But the psychological impact was even more potent. Survivors spoke of feeling the whispered vigilance of the departed in the very stones protecting them. The artifacts of his reign tell a story of calculated desperation. Unlike his predecessor's gold-adorned weapons, Teshub's ceremonial sword was forged from melted-down temple door hinges, its blade inscribed not with victories but with the names of abandoned Hittite outposts. A cache of famine scrolls discovered in 2017 reveals his scribe's macabre accounting. Lists of noble families who volunteered for the long sleep during sieges, their rationed portions keeping soldiers alive just days longer. Most poignant is a child's leather shoe found beneath Carchemish's western gate, its sole stuffed with chaff and inscribed with a royal seal, likely part of a doomed attempt to smuggle grain past enemy lines. Teshub's end came not in battle but in a final act of theatrical sacrifice. Facing an Assyrian army at his gates, he didn't don armor. Instead, he climbed the city walls wearing the faded robes of a Hittite high priest, clutching a bronze thunderbolt relic from Hattusa's ruins. Witness tablets describe how he raised the artifact toward a cloudless sky, and in that moment a sandstorm swallowed the horizon. By the time the dust cleared, the king was gone. Some claimed the storm god had claimed his own. Others whispered he walked into the desert to bargain with older powers. The only certainty, when the Assyrians entered Carchemish, they found the throne room empty save for a single clay brick on the seat, its surface bearing a finger-carved message: "The king is wherever the storm still speaks." Centuries later, neo-Hittite rulers would invoke those words as proof their lineage endured not in palaces, but in the wind that scours the ruins of fallen cities. The last neo-Hittite kings ruled as shadows of a vanished empire, their crowns heavy with the ghosts of Hattusa's glory. Scattered across Syria and southern Anatolia, these successor states Carchemish, Malatia, Carchemish, clung to fragments of Hittite identity while Assyrian war drums grew louder at their gates. Their story isn't one of dramatic last stands but of quiet erosion. Treaties signed in dust, royal marriages that doubled as surrender terms, and the slow fading of cuneiform into obscurity. Take Suppiluliuma of Kama, a king who paid tribute to Assyria in iron ingots shaped like Hittite thunderbolts, a smirk hidden in plain sight, as if to say, "Our gods still forge your weapons." Archaeology paints a poignant picture of this twilight era. At Telepinu, the palace of King Wasuama still bears the charred marks of Assyrian torches, but dig deeper and you'll find child-sized clay tablets in the ruins. Practice exercises where young scribes copied out Hittite royal titles generations after they held real power. These weren't lessons, they were incantations willing the past back to life one stroke at a time. Even the Assyrians noticed the obsession. Royal correspondence from Nineveh mocks a neo-Hittite envoy for presenting a treaty on a bronze tablet, as if Tarhunt still shakes the sky, while demanding the same document be rewritten on Assyrian parchment. Yet some rulers fought back with cultural guerrilla warfare. King Kamani of Carchemish commissioned statues of storm gods with deliberately archaic features, their faces modeled on reliefs from Hattusa's golden age. His masterstroke, burying foundation deposits beneath the city gates containing fragments of broken Hittite treaties, not as surrender but as a threat. When Assyrian envoys complained, Kamani's priests calmly explained they were binding the old oaths to the new stones, implying divine vengeance would punish any invader. It worked for nearly a decade. The end came not with a bang but with a bureaucratic sigh. The final known neo-Hittite ruler. The Hittite kings didn't vanish when their empire fell, they melted into legend, their thunderous deeds distilled into whispers carried by traders, refugees, and conquerors across the ancient world. Long after Hattusa's walls crumbled, their legacy pulsed beneath the surface of history, resurfacing in unexpected ways. Take the famous Cyrus cylinder, where Persia's great emperor borrowed the Hittite concept of divinely mandated restoration, or the eerie parallels between Hittite treaty curses and biblical injunctions against oath breakers. Even the Greeks, who claimed to despise barbarian cultures, wove Hittite motifs into their own myths. The storm god Tarhunt's battles with the serpent Ilianka eerily mirror Zeus's fights with Typhon, while the tragic figure of Telepinu, the vanishing god, seems to echo in Dionysian resurrection rituals. Modern archaeology has peeled back these layers of myth to reveal startling truths. When Hugo Winkler uncovered Hattusa's archives in 1906, he didn't just find crumbling tablets, he stumbled upon an entire cosmology frozen in clay. The Hittites' meticulous record-keeping preserved everything from royal decrees to laundry lists, offering us something rare in ancient history. Not just what kings claimed to be, but who they actually were. One tablet lists Suppiluliuma I's headache remedies alongside battle plans, while another captures a scribe's doodle of a grumpy-looking chariot horse in the margin of a tax record. These humanizing details collapse 3 millennia in an instant, reminding us these weren't just names on a timeline, they were fathers, strategists, poets, and occasionally victims of their own ambition. Their rediscovery reshaped our understanding of the ancient world. Before the Hittite archives were deciphered, historians saw the Bronze Age through Egyptian and Mesopotamian eyes, a world where these civilizations dominated unchallenged. Now we know there was a third superpower, a kingdom that could match Ramses blow for blow at Kadesh, whose legal codes influenced Hammurabis, and whose mercantile network stretched from the Aegean to the Euphrates. Even their downfall left fingerprints. Neo-Hittite cities like Carchemish became cultural transmission belts, preserving Hittite art, religion, and governance long enough for Assyria and later Persia to absorb them. Yet the most enduring mystery isn't what we've learned about the Hittites, it's what they still hide. Less than 10% of their known sites have been excavated, and new technologies keep unlocking secrets. Ground-penetrating radar recently revealed a vast underground complex beneath Hattusa, possibly a royal necropolis, while spectral imaging on burned tablets is recovering ghost texts invisible to the naked eye. Some scholars believe the Hittites' greatest achievement wasn't their empire, but their adaptability. their ability to merge foreign gods with their own, to rewrite history when needed, to dissolve into new identities while keeping their core intact. Perhaps that's why their legacy feels so alive today. When modern diplomats cite treaty obligations, they're echoing Suppilulium I's silver tablet pacts. When we debate how leaders balance pragmatism and ideology, we're retreading the same ground as Telepinu the lawgiver. And every time a storm rolls in over the Anatolian plateau, somewhere in the thunder, you can almost hear the old Hittite kings laughing, knowing that while empires rise and fall, the stories of those who dared to bargain with the gods never truly die. Their final lesson, that history isn't just about power but about persistence, not just the throne you sit on, but the echoes you leave in the silence after. From the dream-filled rise of Suppiluliuma I to the tragic twilight of Qzi-Teshub, the Hittite kings proved that true power isn't just forged in battle, it's etched into the collective imagination. These were rulers who didn't merely command armies, they orchestrated celestial signs, weaponized curses, and bargained with gods as equals. Think of Labarna planting his golden scepter in myth to grow an empire, or Mursili turning a lunar eclipse into psychological warfare at Kadesh. Even in collapse, they wielded mysticism as armor. Tudhaliya IV building cosmic clocks as his world crumbled, or Talmi Sharuma whispering forgotten gods' names beneath Hittite-approved rituals. What makes their legacy immortal isn't just the treaties they signed or the cities they conquered, but the stories they spun around their thrones like spiders' silk, stories so potent they still shimmer in the cracks of history. When archaeologists brush dust off a tablet describing Telepinu's legal reforms or Hattusili's dream journals, they're not just recovering facts, they're eavesdropping on conversations between mortals and the divine, where every drought was a god's displeasure and every victory a shared triumph with the storm god's thunder. Now it's your turn to walk these ancient corridors. Which king's saga resonates with you? The lawgiver who turned bureaucracy into sacred art, the warrior priest who fought battles with hymns as fiercely as swords? Or maybe the shadow rulers whose names were almost erased, like Kuranta the rebel or Zidanta the enigma? Drop your pick in the comments, and if these tales of ambition and mysticism left you hungry for more, hit that subscribe button. Our next deep dive unlocks the secrets of another civilization lost to time, where history and legend blur just as dramatically. Until then, keep listening for whispers in the ruins. The past isn't done speaking yet.